Welcome, comrades, to this very important meeting. Today, we will hear a presentation by the party on the necessity of a real general strike and how the workers' movement can bring such a strike into being. We will conclude with a period of question and answers during which attendees can ask questions to party militants on the issues presented here. We encourage all those who wish to join the party in this essential work to visit our website, review our press, and email us if they are prepared to begin engaging seriously in the struggle for world communism. We also publish a bi-monthly newspaper, the International Communist Party, as well as a regular theoretical magazine. Subscriptions can be attained at clpublishers.com or by request. The subject of today's event is the question of the general strike, how we understand it, how it may emerge, and the necessity of developing the trade union united front from below. To answer these questions, we must first start with a few basic observations. Today, the global capitalist system continues to face a profound and deepening economic crisis, driving it towards ever more brutal attacks against the international working class. Rising costs of living coincide with stagnating wages. Alongside this economic pressure, repression expands. Policing is increasingly militarized, borders are more tightly enforced, and systems of mass incarceration are used to control workers and suppress resistance. In the United States, these systems were built in the last century to contain rebellions of the black proletariat. Workers pushed into the role of capital's surplus labor force, segregated into urban ghettos, and kept on starvation wages for generations after the collapse of slavery. Capital now turns its eyes towards the intensified exploitation of immigrant workers. As US imperialism once again asserts its right to murder and kill with impunity in Latin America under its revitalized Monroe Doctrine. All this unfolds amid the expanding slaughter of millions of proletarians in the imperialist wars across the globe, as capitalism increasingly relies on military arms production as a primary and stable form of profit. These horrors are not the result of moral failings of individual politicians or officials who carry out these policies. Rather, those individuals are themselves driven towards such actions by the titanic and impersonal historical forces of capital. Capital, in order to preserve itself, must constantly and relentlessly accumulate. To do so, it must violently defend its profit rates and its system of private property and wage labor, relying on the policing and military institutions that make up the capitalist state. The attacks experienced by the working class today are therefore not simply the policies of this or that capitalist party, democratic or fascistic, but the necessary outcome of an economic system compelled to secure the conditions for the perpetual exploitation of wage labor, the lifeblood of capitalism itself. Thus, for us communists, there is no goal in reforming this or that aspect of the capitalist state, nor in abolishing individual agencies taken as a whole, inevitably return to the most ruthless and violent exploitation of the working class. Our interest lies elsewhere. It lies solely in increasing the fighting capacity of the working class. First, so that it may truly defend itself, its wages, and its standard of living against the capitalist offensive, and later, so that it may take the offensive in turn. Only through armed confrontation in the course of the future class civil war, eliminate and overthrow the capitalist state, implement the dictatorship of the proletariat exercised by the party through the councils of armed workers. This is not a theory invented for the occasion. It is the classical, orthodox Marxist theory of revolution, confirmed in practice by the proletarian revolution of October 1917 in Russia. Its international advance was not disproved, but delayed, first by the counter-revolutionary world wars, and then by the global imposition of fascistic state policies by the victorious democratic powers. In defeating fascism, these democracies adopted its essential features: the regimentation of the population, the abandonment of so-called democratic guarantees, the omnipotence of the state, the integration of trade unions into the state apparatus, and the systematic depoliticization of the masses under the weight of loud and unceasing propaganda. This victory of the capitalist class was secured in equal measure by counter-revolutionary forces operating outside the workers' movement and by forces acting within it. It was consolidated internally through the incorrect tactics of the Third International. First through the policy of the United Front from above, and later through the methods of the Popular Front. These tactics subordinated the independent struggle of the proletariat to alliances, maneuvers, and objectives foreign to its class of interests. thereby disarming the working class at the very moment when the revolutionary clarity and independence were required. We return to this history today because history does not simply pass, it repeats itself. Even bourgeois historians recognize that those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it. And today, as we face a deepening economic and social crisis of capitalism on all sides, we once again see the same old methods of social opportunism presented to the working class as false solutions. For this reason, workers must return to their own history, to its lessons, and to the consciousness of itself contained in the doctrine and its party, in order to affirm the correct path forward. Today, in the United States and in many other parts of the world, renewed calls for a general strike have emerged, and this is a positive development. Yet already, activist organizations and leftist political groups, working in coalition with the boss-linked leadership of the established unions and the Democratic Party, are moving to weaken and dilute this tactic. They advance a new Popular Front initiative aimed at pulling workers away from a struggle in defense of their common wages and conditions and into a partisan conflict between bourgeois factions, framed as a defense of democracy against fascism. In this way, the working class is mobilized not for mass strike action, but for mass protests designed to support electoral maneuvers by competing bourgeois parties, all in the service of restoring and stabilizing the capitalist system of exploitation itself. Recently, as many as 50,000 people took part in the protest in Minneapolis, under the leadership of the so-called Ice Out Coalition, a local activist organization that succeeded in securing support from sections of the Democratic Party and the petty bourgeoisie. Nearly 1,000 small businesses closed their doors in support of the action, likely because the exploitation of cheap immigrant labor is essential to maintaining their narrow profit margins. Although some groups described this action as a general strike, it was in reality a large one-day protest. Its demands include Minnesota for legal accountability of state officers, for an end to funding for Trump-era ICE policies, and for corporations, large and small, to deny to ICE agents by declaring themselves Fourth Amendment businesses. Alongside these demands were familiar appeals to uphold the Constitution, to defend democracy, and to protect abstract rights framed as universal and inalienable. The role played by the unions that endorsed this protest makes its character ever clearer. Teamsters Local 638 issued a statement reminding workers that striking would be illegal. IATSC Local 13 told workers that they were free to choose whether to participate, provided that their employers were notified in advance. SEIU Healthcare Minnesota warned that taking part in strike action could result in termination. The president of CWA Local 7250 stated, quote, "We have not voted on a strike, but our union is calling on people to support this call." The Minnesota Nurses Association appealed the workers' essential caregiving role as a moral reason to respect the no strike clause, while openly describing the nature of its endorsement by stating that it was joining a, quote, broad and growing coalition of labor organizations, faith leaders, business owners, and community members across Minnesota. According to the New York Times, the president of the MNA went so far as to discourage members from missing work altogether, alongside other labor leaders. What we see here is the real function of the business union leadership, to suppress militancy wherever it arises on its own, by telling workers not to take action, and in many cases not even to vote on taking more serious action. This layer works to neutralize struggle and keep it safely within legal limits. They do this in order to protect their own privileged position, salaries and careers far removed from the conditions faced by the average worker. These leaders fear breaking labor law because in doing so puts their jobs and incomes at risk. As a result, instead of relying on the collective power on the working class, they seek influence and protection through alliances with other classes. This is what drives them into united fronts that preserve the existing order, contain struggle, and ultimately leave the status quo untouched. Despite these repeated calls to contain and neutralize the struggle, workers must fight for a real general strike, an indefinite collective withdrawal of labor that halts production, paralyzes profit, and demonstrates the true power of a united working class. This is the strongest weapon workers possess to defend their living standards and to resist mass repression, including violent deportations. A real general strike brings together busboys and bus drivers, domestic workers and native-born workers, the organized and the unorganized, acting together as a single class. While we welcome the growing fighting spirit and the increasing willingness of workers across the United States to act collectively, it is necessary to reject every distortion what a general strike actually is. It is not a one-day economic shutdown. It is not a consumer boycott. It is not individuals staying at home at the urging of capitalist politicians. And it is not bosses temporarily locking out workers for the day. These spectacles replace all real power with symbolism and leave capitalism fundamentally untouched. A general strike means workers standing together, arm in arm, confronting both the bosses and the state through the collective withholding of labor power. It must be organized and led explicitly by working class defensive organizations. It cannot grow out of loose networks of individuals acting separately, and it cannot be built through interclass coalitions that blur the line between workers and their exploiters. Again and again, such coalitions take justified anger and redirect it into voting for the Democratic Party. In doing so, they strengthen capitalism while delaying the development of real, militant working class self defense. This is not accidental. Both major parties, Democratic and Republican alike, depend on repression, especially immigration enforcement, to regulate the labor market. Borders are opened and closed as needed to supply cheap, precarious labor and to drive wages down across the entire working class. For this reason, immigrant and domestic workers face the same enemy and must unite in the common defense of wages and living standards across borders. This requires a decisive break with the United Front from above. That is, alliances with NGOs, activist formations, and political parties that divert struggle into electoral channels, and the deliberate construction of a united front from below, bringing together all workers' defensive organizations for collective strike action. In practical terms, this means building class struggle workplace committees and territorial strike committees, whether inside or outside existing unions, among both organized and unorganized workers. These bodies must be committed to advancing workers' immediate demands without holding back, out of respect for suffocating legal restraints designed to contain labor power. That includes the rules imposed by the National Labor Relations Board and the no strike clauses written into contracts. Only through coordinated action across sectors, across unions, and across borders can workers begin to build the material force required for a real general strike, whether towards May 1st, 2028 or sooner. The need for this independence is clearest when we look at immigration policy. The capitalist state does not act on humanitarian grounds. It regulates immigration according to the labor needs of capital. During periods of expansion, immigrant labor is selectively tolerated or encouraged in order to supply cheap, flexible workers. During periods of crisis, repression intensifies in order to discipline the labor market and drive wages downward. Deportations, raids, and permanent condition of illegality are not accident or excesses. They are tools used to enforce wage differences that are central to profitability under global imperialism. As long as immigrant and foreign workers can be paid less, capital retains a powerful mechanism for dividing the working class. A general strike built around universal wage demands, demands that apply equally to domestic, immigrant, and foreign workers, directly attacks this mechanism and weakens the material foundation of the repression itself. For this reason, the struggle over wages must be the central axis of any serious general strike strategy. The so-called minimum wage is not at its core a number established by law. It is the historically determined minimum that workers are willing to accept based on their level of organization, confidence, and readiness to strike. Capital works constantly to push this minimum downward through inflation, through unemployment, and through oppression. Legislative reforms, collective bargaining agreements, and electoral campaigns do little more than record the results of past struggles. When stretched over years, they are quickly undermined by rising living costs, as seen clearly with the failure of initiatives such as the quote-unquote fight for 15. A general strike organized around wages can impose rapid increases regardless of legislation, because capital cannot function without purchasing labor power. This economic struggle is the foundation of real unions, defensive organizations of wage workers, not political machines designed to reform to the capitalist state. Finally, this focus makes clear why abstract appeals to democratic rights or narrow institutional forms cannot serve as the center of struggle. Even the abolition of a specific repressive agency would leave untouched the economic conditions that made it necessary to capital. Repression would simply reappear in another form. Only the organized and coercive power of the working class, its ability to halt production and disrupt accumulation, can place real limits on the capitalist attack. By fighting for wages determined through collective struggle, and by advancing the perspective of common wage across borders, workers can strike at capital at its foundation. In doing so, they can unite the class internationally and build the organization with and confidence required for broader confrontations with exploitation and repression. Without this independent economic foundation, outrage will continue to be absorbed into electoral dead ends, historical lessons will be erased with each cycle, and capital will emerge strengthened, while workers are once again delayed from the only path that leads to genuine emancipation.
Yeah, our statements and recommendations are not based on any innovative ideas, but on the concrete historical experience of the working class and its struggle with capital, which confirm the possibilities of international proletarian revolution and the necessity of future reemergence of class unionism and the general strike. To demonstrate this, we'll briefly elaborate in a schematic way the manner in which the global working class struggle, at its peak of militancy in the last century, was slowly withered away in the course of the counter-revolution of the last 100 years. The capitalist counter-revolution was met with the counter-revolution within the Third International, as the tactical errors of endorsing interclass coalitional action via the policies of the United Front from above and the Popular Front slowly dissolved independent proletarian defensive organization and confused the role of the party and class relationship, turning the communist parties of the world into mere agents of emerging Soviet imperialism. As in the past, the future general strike and the emergence of the future class unions can only occur at a point when the masses of workers are put in motion for a real struggle with the class of bosses. When the objective situation of capital's social crisis intensifies to the point of reopening revolutionary possibility, as the masses of workers break with the bourgeois legal order and once again demonstrate an enthusiastic return to the historical course of class struggle and emancipation. In the years immediately following the Russian Revolution, the international working class entered a phase of extraordinary militancy unmatched before or ever since. Across Europe and beyond, the revolution acted as a detonator, transforming latent discontent into open class struggle. Mass strikes, factory occupations, workers' councils, and armed confrontations erupted across the world from Germany and Italy to Britain, Hungary, Spain, and the United States. The general strike appeared not as an abstract slogan, but as a practical weapon, repeatedly wielded by the working class and paid for its price in blood. At this historical juncture, as the social contradictions of capital were at a tipping point, leading to an objectively revolutionary situation across the world, workers no longer conceived of the struggle as a series of isolated economic disputes, but as a political confrontation with the capitalist order itself. This was a historic moment in which proletarian independence was not theoretical but material. Workers across the world acted as a class in and for itself, often in direct opposition to capital and its state. The 20th century witnessed not only the eruptions of working class struggle that shook the foundations of capitalist power, but also the equally decisive political strategies that blunted and subverted and ultimately domesticated that struggle. Among these strategies, none proved more effective in dismantling working class independence than the shift from the united front from below to the united front from above, and finally to the Popular Front, as adopted by the Third International as the Stalinist counter-revolution began to take hold within the international communist movement, returning it for all intents and purposes back to the old program of social democracy. Far from advancing proletarian revolution, these political maneuvers reoriented the working class away from independent class action and towards an interclass politics of coalition and compromise, making wide-scale general strike activity once the genuine expression of class power, virtually impossible. The original Leninist conception of a united front, workers united at the grassroots in struggle, was transformed under pressure from stagnating revolution in Russia and across Europe and rising counter-revolutionary forces into what can only be described as a united front from above. Rather than mobilizing workers around independent demands and collective action, communist parties entered into negotiated agreements with reformist leaders of the social democratic parties of the Second International, and the duplicitous political maneuvering between leaders of these parties and the established unions, subordinating rank and file initiative to centralized political bargaining to accomplish electoral maneuvers and voting blocks. This shift was already a betrayal of communist principles and proletarian class independence. Collective action from the bottom up in organizing the workers' movement was replaced with administrative coordination, and the dynamic capacity of workers to organize general strikes was stunted in favor of formal alliances to support these voting blocs in bourgeois parliaments. By the early 1930s, as the threat of fascism intensified, this tactical compromise gave rise to the fully developed Popular Front approach. Broad coalitions, including communists, social democrats, radical liberals, and other sectors of the bourgeoisie, all united against looming fascist dictatorship. However, the alliance worked by subordinating workers' general strike power to the political interests of the bourgeoisie, suppressing general strikes in favor of advancing the electoral agendas of bourgeois politicians under the misguided idea that through electoralism, the trend of capitalism towards fascism could be prevented. Our party, on the other hand, always understood that fascism is the most developed form of capitalism, not a regression back into previous forms, as was thought at the time by many of the other communist parties across the world. And so the march towards fascism within capitalism is historically inevitable and can only be ended through proletarian revolution, not through the preservation of democracy, which is itself a previous earlier stage of capitalism. This lie, which has been used to justify countless imperialist wars, that democracy must be defended against dictatorship, is so used up by the bourgeois itself that it can no longer hide that it is itself completely fascist at this point. The Spanish Popular Front presents the clearest demonstration of what this strategy entailed and how it operated to disempower the working class. In Spain, a coalition government was formed in 1936 under the banner of defending the Republican order against reactionary forces. What was heralded as anti-fascist unity, however, quickly revealed its political character. Not an alliance of workers for emancipation, but an alliance of class forces defending the bourgeois democratic state. The Popular Front's politics subordinated proletarian agency to the preservation of parliamentary democracy and thus capitalism during the Spanish Civil War. Radical workers, instead of wielding their own power, were redirected into supporting a political order that ultimately refrained from empowering them to act decisively. And many leaders of the working class, the most militant, faced assassination by both fascists, Republicans, and Stalinists. This had immediate consequences for the capacity of the working class to carry out effective general strikes. Every call for restraint, every appeal to maintain unity with bourgeois parties translated it into a limitation on workers' independent action and subordination of the development of the working class's struggle in favor of the illusory defense of democracy. The general strike, once the ultimate expression of class autonomy, was now seen as potentially divisive, dangerous to the unity, or even counterproductive to the broader coalition during the Popular Front period. Thus, the Popular Front did not merely fail to stop fascism, which now all of the capitalist states across the world openly show themselves to be, it eviscerated the independent organizational capacity of the working class, rendering it politically passive at the decisive moment, thus accomplishing for the fascists what they themselves had a very hard time doing in their own countries. The same strategic error was then exported across the Atlantic in the United States, The Communist Party, CPUSA, following Comintern directives, embraced Roosevelt's New Deal as a centerpiece of a broad popular front strategy within the degenerating Third International, which was liquidating the global working class movement to advance the imperial interests of the newly emerging capitalism in the Stalinized Soviet Union. The New Deal, far from being a revolutionary rupture, was a set of reforms designed to stabilize capitalism by channeling mass discontent, which emerged after the Great Depression and the economic crisis of that time, into state program designated to quell workers' unrest and stabilize capital, establishing a legacy which still deeply haunts the American working class today. Just as the European Popular Front bound workers to defense of bourgeois democracy against fascism, CPUSA's strategy in the United States bound workers to endorsing the inter-imperialist war, not for advancing any independent path of proletarian action, but towards subordinating the working class towards the interest of factional disputes of global imperialism. Independent working class politics were not cultivated, they were absorbed. Where revolutionary potential once existed in the real threat of general strikes, CPUSA's popular frontism directed workers towards electoral politics and reformist campaigns. The communist parties of the world, which were once agents of further encouraging international working class militancy towards revolution, increasingly found themselves campaigning for Democratic Party candidates, promoting New Deal policies, and functioning as loyal allies of the capitalist state. Despite the political containment of the working class, however, material conditions would once again arise that would spontaneously push the masses towards general strike action. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, mass strike action emerged across much of the industrialized world, with a force that recalled the earlier revolutionary period. Demobilization, inflation, food shortages, and the unfulfilled promises of wartime sacrifice produced enormous working class anger. Between 1945 and 48, millions of workers struck in France, Italy, Britain, and across Western Europe. Factories were occupied, production halted, and entire sectors are paralyzed. These struggles revealed that the proletariat, despite years of war discipline and nationalist propaganda, had not lost its capacity for collective action. Yet this resurgence unfolded under the political leadership that had already been reshaped by the Popular Front logic. Communist parties, now committed to national reconstruction, parliamentary legitimacy, and alliance with bourgeois and social democratic forces, actively worked to restrain and demobilize the very movements they nominally led. Strikes were carefully limited in scope and duration, and ultimately called off in the name of rebuilding the nation and preserving democratic stability. In country after country, this strategy transformed mass strikes from potential challenges to state power into bargaining tools subordinated to capitalist recovery, leading not to victories, but to exhaustion, disillusionment, and defeat. In the United States, the post war strike wave of 1945 to 46, one of the largest in American history, was met with a coordinated political counteroffensive. Millions of workers in steel, auto, and coal and rail walked out, demonstrating a latent capacity for industry wide and potentially general strike action. But this militancy was rapidly contained through a combination of legal repression and political realignment. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 imposed severe restrictions on strikes, outlawed solidarity actions, and bound unions to the legal framework of the capitalist state, while forcing union leaders to purge communists through loyalty oaths. At the same time, the Second Red Scare targeted militants, destroyed rank and file leadership, and isolated communists within the labor movement. The Communist Party, already committed to Popular Front loyalty to the Democratic Party and post war national unity, offered no independent class response. Instead of organizing resistance to repression or generalizing the strike wave, it adapted to the new legal and political order. The combined effect of state repression and Popular Front accommodation was decisive. Mass strike action was broken, working class independence was crippled, and the general strike was reduced from a material possibility to a historical memory. Today, as the global post war economic order erodes, open confrontation between the imperialist powers escalate, just as the attacks on the wages of workers, domestic and immigrant, within the centers of global imperialism intensify. As history repeats itself, the working class must not also repeat the same mistakes of the past. It must avoid the easy path of opportunism and the pie in the sky elixirs promised by electoral reformism that falsely hopes to contain the systems of the dying capitalist system without the associated sacrifices of entering into a real struggle with the class enemy, which will not be removed from the historical stage without a serious confrontation of forces between the class of the exploited and the class of the exploiters. A united front from below can emerge only through the practical convergence of combative and class unionist forces in struggle, not through agreements among officials or endorsements from political organizations. As workers begin to act collectively around concrete demands, above all, wages, hours, and conditions, workplace committees, strike committees, and territorial workers' assemblies will naturally arise to coordinate actions across shops, industries, and regions. In the course of organizing and sustaining a general strike, these organs will be compelled to centralize their efforts, sharing resources, synchronizing tactics, and enforcing collective decisions against employers and state pressure. This process of coordination, born of necessity, must not dissolve back into temporary coalitions once a strike ebbs. Instead, it must consciously consolidate into a centralized and permanent class union that unites all workers, organized and unorganized, across sectors and borders on a strictly class basis. Such a union would not be a service provider or lobbying body, but a durable organ of collective defense and struggle against the wage system itself, capable of preparing, leading, and generalizing future mass actions, including general strikes, and of sustaining working class independence over time. Towards these ends, the International Communist Party reminds all workers in the United States that a real strike is always indefinite in its duration. We call for the formation of the United Trade Union Front from Below, which brings together in coalition the existing combative and class union forces in the workers' movement, while rejecting the United Front from Above and its coalitional efforts between interclass bodies of workers' organizations and political parties. And we reject Popular Front initiatives, which aim to fuse the existing workers' organizations and their Democratic Party electoral initiatives. Third, we call for the organization of a territorial strike committees and workers' assemblies to organize the general strike, which brings together organized and unorganized workers to coordinate that strike. Fourth, we remind all of the need to center universal wage demands and defense of wages of domestic, immigrant, and foreign workers across borders, unifying all workers' struggle and effectively defeating ICE's objective of delivering super profits through wage differentials enforced by militarism of global imperialism. And finally, beyond the economic demands of the workers, which must serve as the unifying basis of the future general strike, we call for the recognition of citizenship rights of all immigrant workers as a method to end capital's attempts to divide workers on the basis of citizenship and creating a tiered system through that of wages. We prefer this to demands to abolish this or that policing agency as the capitalist state acts as an armed camp of the bourgeois to violently enforce its class order and can only be overthrown in a revolutionary offensive and class civil war, not itself by the trade union struggle.